Louis, she and Louis now go on the Second Crusade. The First Crusade is 1099. Now this is in the middle of the 1100s. And Louis is asked by the Pope to lead the Second Crusade. So at mid-century, 1147, 48, 49, he accepts. He's a very pious man who is very dedicated to the church all his life. And so when he's asked, he agrees. And when his wife hears that he's going to go away for a number of years on a trip to the Holy Land, she says, "I'm coming too." Now, in those days, wives didn't announce that they were coming too, and husbands didn't invite them to come, and particularly not on the crusade where there was going to be war. But Eleanor said, "I'm coming too." And there was no debate about it. That was it. She was coming. And so she organized a whole group of other ladies, like herself, duchesses, who thought it was a wonderful idea. And so she created her own little female traveling group who announced to Louis they were all going on the crusade, going with him and all the gentlemen. The men told him he couldn't do that, told him he should make his wife stay home, and he said, "Well, you try to tell her." So she came, and they all came. They rode horses. They were the scandal of Christendom. He was the scandal because he couldn't control his wife, but she couldn't care less. She was going to go, and did go, and went to the Holy Land. And the whole crusade was a disaster. They did not achieve any military goals like they should. They lost some very major battles. But the worst thing was that when they got to the Holy Land, and they were in some of these cities like Antioch and Damascus and Acre, Eleanor became a cause of scandal. And she became a cause of scandal because she would socialize with relatives from home, from France, and they would have parties, and Louis would be praying in the chapel someplace, and she'd be off at a great rowdy party in Antioch, and all the other men criticized her and criticized Louis for letting her do this, and she said, "Well, why shouldn't I?" One of the men there was her uncle, Raymond of Toulouse. He was one of the most important men in all of Europe, and he was there in control of Antioch, and so he was her uncle, so they would have these wonderful parties where she would speak to him in the dialect language of the South, and the rest of the party couldn't understand what she was saying. So this made her very unpopular among the men, and by the time they left, after having lost battles and lost men and spent a lot of money, and started home, Louis was being criticized. Eleanor was being criticized for her independence and for her doing what she wanted to do, which she always did. And they were on their way home with a bickering couple. They weren't happy. They weren't getting along. And on their way home, they stopped in Rome at St. Peter's to visit the Pope. And while they were with the Pope, Eleanor surprised Louis by saying, "Mr. Pope, I want to get out of this marriage. I want an annulment. Will you get it for me? I've been doing research, and I can see I'm too closely related to Louis, and God is striking us down. We don't have any sons. We need sons, and we're not having sons, and therefore I think that's the reason. So would you please get us an annulment?" Well, Louis said, my, and may we, and the Pope said, "Oh, no, you try harder. Get a therapist, sit down and discuss this." And she said, "Well, all he does is pray. All he does is pray. I don't know how we can have sons because all he does is pray. He doesn't have time for anything else. He's in the chapel all the time praying." And the Pope said, "Well, that's very good to be in the chapel praying. But Louis, remember, you do have responsibility to produce a son. And so you're going to have to get out of the chapel once in a while and take care of your marital duties." And Louis said, "Well, may we. And so now they came home to Paris after this unsuccessful interview with the Pope. And, of course, they were estranged and they weren't happy. And now they came back to Paris, and now the pressure after the crusade grew for him to get rid of her. And now there were other people saying, people in the French government coming to him and saying, "Louis, get rid of Eleanor." Well, then Eleanor produced another child. So that everything stopped for a year because she got pregnant. Oh, good, good, good. That meant Louis had stopped praying for a while and had taken a break from praying. And now along would come the wanted son. And so everybody waited for Eleanor to deliver the wanted son who would be the future king of France. And let me tell you something tonight, because you know that if what history is very interesting, and here's a good one. If she had produced a son, she would have stayed the Queen of France for the rest of her life. There's no question about that. But she didn't. She didn't. She made another little girl. The last thing France wanted. They had all the girls they needed, and they certainly didn't need another royal princess. And so with two girls, they went to Louis and they said, get to the Pope and tell him annulment is okay, do the research, get into the documents, and find out that Eleanor is too closely related to you, and get rid of her. And so Louis very, very, very sadly gave in. He loved her because she was fun, she was exciting, she was beautiful, she was sexy, and he liked her. But he gave up, said okay, and so now the annulment took place. And so now in 1152, Louis and Eleanor, that's our picture of them getting married and taking their trip to the Holy Land, began to make the arrangements for an official separation. In the meantime, a visitor came to Paris. And there's the picture of him, young and handsome, with Eleanor young and beautiful. And she was still very young and very beautiful. And the young and handsome gentleman sitting over there next to the harp, I don't think he brought his harp, but he is the Duke of Normandy. The very young, strapping, big, hunky Duke of Normandy. Still a teenager, but already hunky. And so Eleanor was most interested during the visit of the Duke of Normandy to Paris, come to do his obeisance, his official obeisance to the King of France. There he was. And they were all together. Everybody was together. I'm not suggesting any hanky-panky. All he did was listen to a little harp music. But, certainly, they did find a couple of minutes to step out there onto that balcony and look at the stars. And something was said by someone to someone that had something to do with, when you get rid of Louis, think of me. When you get rid of Louis, think of me. And so Eleanor left Paris, 1152, and retired to her territory, which was all the southwest of France. Now, when she got out of the marriage from Louis, she then took her duchy with her. That was the deal. Louis got to keep the girls. She got her territory back. Of course, it was her territory, so he couldn't keep it. So in the annulment, the Duchess of Aquitaine takes her Aquitaine back, and Poitiers, because that's another county that she controlled. And so she retired to her castle in Poitiers, which is a very important spot on the road. You see it right there to Paris. So it was a good place to be based. Here's the castle at Poitiers. You can visit that. It's still there. And so here she came, retiring home from being the former queen of Paris, and came home here to Poitiers and lived in the castle. And then, during the next few months, she had a lot of visitors in her beautiful Poitiers. And obviously one of them carried an important letter from Duke Henry from Normandy, and one of those letters said, Eleanor, be my wife. Make me husband number 2. And she said, oui, oui. And so, without anybody knowing, how they kept it a secret is amazing, because they had to be writing back and forth. But without anyone knowing, in May of 1152, so just months after she left Paris, it was announced all over West France, and finally the news got to Paris, that the Duke of Normandy and the Duchess of Aquitaine had married each other. And I'm going to put on the screen this map, because this is one of the most important maps of our story here tonight, which is the Angevin Empire. That is a name that comes out of this story here tonight, Angevin, and the name Angevin comes from the city Angers, Angers. I'm going to show it to you in a second. And the Angevin Empire is born in May 1152 when Eleanor, the Duchess of Aquitaine, marries Henry, the Duke of Normandy. 1152, spring of 1152. And in the moment that they marry is born the Angevin Empire. They marry here in this spectacular. Isn't that just gorgeous? That is Notre Dame le Grand, the great Notre Dame in Poitiers, one of the most beautiful Romanesque churches in all of Europe, and capturing exactly the style of a church in the early 1100s, which is going to be made old-fashioned once the Basilica of Saint-Denis is completed and Notre Dame in Paris by 1200. So this is the church you'd see in 1100, and Notre Dame would be the church you'd see in 1200. This is one of the biggest transformations in all of history. If we just look at some of the photos of the front of Notre Dame le Grand, look at the sculpture. Look at the wonderful, perfect Roman doors. These, of course, are why it's called Romanesque. Look at the sculpture up in the corners. And so, with the marriage of Eleanor and Henry, is born the Angevin Empire. Here's a map of France, and you see the yellow arrow up there that your professor put in there. That is Angers. And so Angers sits right there in the middle of the Angevin Empire. If I go back to the map of the Angevin Empire, you can see that it's better placed than, say, Bordeaux would be or Poitiers. It's more northern, and it's on the Loire River, so you can easily get in and out through the Atlantic through a ship. And, of course, it allowed them to control the empire both north. His is north of that, hers is south of that. The center of this empire is that castle. You can visit that. It's the great castle, the Chateau of Angers. It's exactly the way it was in their time. You can see those great, huge turrets and the walls, and then they controlled the river. So it was one of the greatest centers for an empire. And so in 1152, that was their idea. She controlled the south, he controlled the north, and between the two of them, they had more territory than France. So their territory, Normandy and Aquitaine, was way bigger than the full territory of France. All of this was based on the Loire Valley. There's Angers at the west end of our picture. Not far away is Tours. Not far away is the castle of Chinon, which will be very important to Henry and to Richard and to John and to the King of France. Not far away is Fontevraud Abbey, where Eleanor is buried. Not far away, of course, is Orléans and Paris. So this is the center of the Angevin Empire. And then, if it wasn't already worrisome enough for the King of France, he now was informed 2 years later that Henry had become King of England. The king who was on the throne at that point, King Stephen, had died, and Henry was the legitimate successor. And so now in 1154, Henry and Eleanor prepared to journey to England and to claim Henry's inheritance, which of course was going to be this spectacular empire. Now, if you look at the map of the Angevin Empire, you realize that it goes from Scotland all the way in the north to the Pyrenees in the south. So overnight, in 2 years, this had become the greatest piece of real estate in all of Europe, dwarfing France, dwarfing Italy, all the other territories, and it was all in the hands of Henry and Eleanor. And Henry was how old? 21 years old. He was just a kid